Okay. We are there.
All right.
Just make sure here.
Login challenge accepted
Yes.
and completed.
And away we go. Okay, it is 8 o'clock in the East. Do you know where your children are? We are here to talk about 2 books today and continue to read them. For the last 2 weeks, and now this is the 3rd session, we have been reading 2 books. One is The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft, and this is just a remarkable book. Love and Longing in the Unconscious, and it really covers the Eros side of the picture. And the other book is A Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective by Jerry Wright. Now, one of my regular followers had said that Diane's book covers the Eros while Jerry's covers the Logos. And in fairness to Jerry, I just want to say that I've only been reading the Logos part of his book because by request, he did not want me to read the poetry that is in his book. And so his book is quite balanced, but because of his request that I not read the poetry, I'm just reading the Logos part. And so that doesn't detract from it at all. It's quite balanced, actually. And so I want to, I'll be talking a little bit more about that when we go to Jerry's book in a minute. But I just want you to be aware that this is just also a beautiful book. They're both beautiful books, although Diane provides pictures and poetry, which is more from the Eros side, whereas Jerry deals more with the Logos side in the parts that I'm reading. Now, both of these people are going to be speaking to us on the wisdom path, and that will be beginning on April the 11th. Diane is going to speak to us, and then the following week on April 18th, Jerry is going to speak to us on the wisdom path. And then on the 25th, Diane is going to come back for the second part of her presentation. And so I urge you to pay attention and come to those. I'm just looking here just for a moment. I'm going to give you the link so that you can register and receive the notices. So this is putting this on the YouTube chat so that you can register for the Wisdom Path in order to receive the notices of these actual sessions and to join us on those dates to do Q&A with these 2 wonderful writers. And so I'm going to begin today, as I have the last 2 weeks, with Diane Croft's book, The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious. And so we are up to page 32, which is called My Nature. And once again, I'll point out to you that on your left side, on this page, there's a poem, and then there's an image. And then on the right side is a quote from a famous individual, and then Diane's commentary, which follows. So that's how every page goes, or every 2 pages go. And so I'm going to read these one at a time and alternate with Jerry's book. So here's My Nature by Diane Croft. Mother Nature lies outside me, keeping her own private vigil, wild, primordial, indifferent. Even as the sea swallows a village, or rain never comes, she moves of her own accord. Unconscious of my grief, for if she knew, all would be lost each time I fall. And the image that's on this page is called Nixie. It's a 1970 image by Margrethe Hofheinz Dering. It's in the Galerie Brigitte Mosch in Germany. And then this quote from C.G. Jung. Venerabilis. Sorry, I'm not good with getting my
Venerabilis.
Venerabilis. Latin terms. Venerabilis natura. Okay, venerable nature is the translation. Does not halt at the opposites. She uses them to create out of opposition a new birth. And that's from The Psychology of the Transference by C.G. Jung. Now, this is a fundamental idea of alchemy and everything that we talk about in Jungian psychology. And you can think of it as basically in the opposites. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis of the two. And that synthesis is symbolic of the combination of the two. And that's how we develop throughout our lives. And that's a fundamental of Jungian psychology. And everyone who follows here on this YouTube channel should know that.
Well, and I would draw attention to the small glyph by the title on the top right of the picture, that it has two almost the coiled fern roots. Yes, exactly. And if you look at that, that's two pairs of syzygies, or two pairs of opposing pairs that are united to make the one glyph. So I feel like visually that glyph that she has throughout the book is actually a visual unseen partner symbol that she or someone else has made up, that I found interesting as I looked into it, that you had that crossing of the two pairs, which speaks visually right to what you just said.
See, that's why I'm glad Jordan has joined us again, because Jordan has a good eye for these things, and I had not even noticed that. So anyway, let me give you Diane's commentary. My nature. I think of this poem as a symbolic description of the relationship of the ego to the self. The self operates autonomously, unconscious of the emotional roller coaster of the ego, because it exists outside of rational consciousness. But the poem implies that this seemingly uncaring attitude of the self toward ego consciousness bestows a benefit, for if she knew, all would be lost. This supports Jung's idea that when the expressions of the unconscious psyche are interpreted symbolically, as well as tested sensibly against reality, it can serve as a counterbalance to the one-sided tendency of the conscious standpoint. The self's objectivity in relation to the ego's subjectivity serves a germane purpose. It offers the potential to meaningful direct conscious as well as unconscious functioning toward a more complete expression of the individual. But the non-rational qualities of the self can also stir up trouble. Example, floods and droughts. If not properly regulated, Jungian analyst Edward C. Whitmont explains in The Symbolic Quest. We see now how this other a priori personality may appear very negative, threatening, or even evil to the ego, which thinks of itself as the personality. And if not granted a right to exist in reality, it may indeed turn out to be quite destructive. On the other hand, the objective psyche has its positive aspects as well. It contains all of the potential creativity, developmental abilities, and goals of life. And so this is a very fundamental idea in Jungian psychology. The self is the God image. It's the part of the self that guides you in life. And also it's the part of you that when you experience trauma of any kind, whether it's loss of a parent, as Jordan recently experienced, or anything else, it's what balances that out in one's own psyche so that you can go on living. And so if you go and listen to my video, Finding the Living God, you can actually hear me describe and see what happens when a whole bunch of different things happen to me in very different contexts. But in each case, it can be interpreted as God speaking to me, or it can be interpreted as just, your psyche doing something, which it does, which it is. But, it's not a very poetic way of thinking about it. And it's much preferable to think of it as the God within your God, your part of God, that is helping you through a difficult time. And that's what it's doing. Jordan, comments?
Yeah, I think it's really important to call out the a priori personality. It may appear very negative. A priori philosophically being that which has no prior, that which has no before. There's the whole, or that which had given birth to itself, which is a very deity, God, mythical concept. But that then brings in the a priori personality as the connection point to the unconscious and the collective unconscious, as if the imaginal ego inside is an app installed by the collective unconscious in our personality, but not by us. It's developed naturally of its own accord from a capital O other, or the unconscious. So I think that's where that personality, a priori personality, may appear very negative, threatening, or even evil to the ego, which thinks of itself as a personality, because it's so pure, capital N, nature contents, which means it's highly intense and undiluted. And also it comes as a threatening surprise because the ego thinks it's the only thing there. But then that imaginal ego that's a priori that's in there was coming from another place, i.e. the collective unconscious, I think, in a personal way, which I think that introduces, again, the twin within, with that a priori, that we didn't have anything to do with that. It's there of its own accord, or of whatever accord has put it there.
Right. Okay. And so Diane is speaking from the irrational side when she's talking about these things. And the irrational side is just as important as the rational side, because you need to see it in both ways. And it doesn't, although irrational suggests it's something bad, it's not that at all. It's actually where life is.
It is. I'd say that the phrase that I came up with years ago to support that kind of irrational was, it's the place where reasons are all unreasonable. And you stay with the image, you stay with what is, you stay with it, or the topic, or the feature that you're focused on. But it reminds me of Mark Twain's quote, that when I say reasons are unreasonable, he said, well, son, of course truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction has to make sense. And, which implies that truth doesn't often make sense.
Right. Now, one other point on that, which is a very important point from Dr. Jung's work, is found in Answer to Job, paragraph 751, where he says, what most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically. Equally, these people have still not got it into their heads that the psychology of religion falls into two categories, which must be sharply distinguished from one another. First, the psychology of the religious person, and secondly, the psychology of religion proper, i.e., the religious contents. Okay, so here, if we were talking about that idea in the context of Diane's work in this particular segment, once you put anything on paper like this, so that you are establishing words on a page, once you do that, you've already gone to the logos. Okay, that's the logos. And eros is that which Diane is pointing to, not the words on the page or not the words I'm reading. And so once it's in words like that, then it is more like a religion and not like the attitude of the religious person. And so what I want to do here is, at this point, before I go into Jerry's book, I want to show you a quote that most people have seen if you've been following this channel, and that is this paragraph. This is my title to this paragraph, but to me, it's sort of the fulcrum of all Jungian psychology. And I've added the two words in brackets, white in brackets. So for thousands of years, the mind of man has worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. Now, when Dr. Jung is referring to soul here, he is referring to the psyche in its entirety, the human psyche. And in the context of the whole society, that would be the collective unconscious. And in the context of the individual, the God image, which is your unconscious. So,
Skip, something came to me when you read that this time, that early on we worried probably most likely about the sick soul before the sick body. And what struck me is that primitively, that would be an acknowledgement of the unknown and the unseen, and just a little bitty baby vestigial God complex of there is something other than this body that we pay attention to.
Well, and it's quite obvious because even Jordan Peterson, who claims to be the savior of the logos, admits that science cannot explain life. Life
Right.
itself is in the eros. It's not in the logos. Logos is explaining what you're
Right.
what
Like, yeah, Ricky Ricardo, a little
you
explaining
know.
to do. It's like,
Yeah. In other words, when Diane has to go to a book to tell you about her experiences, um, that's explaining. That's
right.
explaining. But and so that becomes logos right there. But it's pointing to something that was in her life, that is in her life, that's in all of our lives, in fact. And the reason I'm reading her book is because I regard her book as a terrific primer on individuation itself, which is the fundamental central tenet of Jungian psychology. Now, the reason I gave you the quote from paragraph 367 of volume 10 is because Dr. Jung, during his lifetime, because he was descended from theologians. His father was a pastor, and he had 7 uncles who were pastors, and they had pastors all the way back.
Kind
I
of
think
steeped in the tradition.
yeah, I think it was hard for him to get enough distance from it so that he could point back and say what he really needed to say. That, oh, by the way, everything I wrote is about religion. And this was something that I had to come to myself after years of reading Jung. I mean, I read Jung for 18 years before I read about him and quotes from him, as Jordan Peterson does. I got this from Jung, says Peterson. So there are lots of nice quotes from Jung that Jordan Peterson uses, so many that Paul Vanderklay assumes that he's a Jungian. And so when Paul and I interviewed a year and a half ago or so, Paul said, well, Peterson's a Jungian or something to that effect. And I said, no, he's not. He's nothing like a Jungian. And the reason is simply that. And you can see it clearly in the first 2 paragraphs of the Red Book, where he says clearly that he had to walk away from all the splaining, all the and he had to put that aside and forget all of his knowledge and all of the arguments that religion has come up with to defend itself over 2,000 years.
I would say too with Jordan Peterson that, and not to disparage him, I mean, he's doing his thing, but it's a piece of glass is a Jung quote, but what's really behind it, and that's very, to me, scratching the surface. It's when are you going to drop in?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of the quote. You said piece of glass. What was that?
Oh, it feels like Jordan Peterson is a bit of a Jungian disco ball. Like all the little squares of glass are each one of them a Jung quote, but what's really in there? And so if I go more to a Jungian topic and go with the ichthyos, or the ichthys, the fish yanked from the deep, it feels like Jordan Peterson is focused on the scales that are scratched off when you clean a fish, but not the fish itself.
Right. And so my point has simply been, and this is I interpolate from Jung that life is in the eros, and yes, there's chaos in the eros. That's true, but so is our life, and we have to differentiate between chaos and life. And yes, we've done a terrific job of pulling together, explaining about our life in superficial ways. But the problem is that science gets to decide what science looks at. And So science likes to hold all variables constant except for one, and then prove something according to one variable. But the problem is that life isn't like that. Life is multivariant. And so if you hold all the others constant, yes, you can get some sort of an answer, but it's only an approximation. And so far as I know, there's no scientific explanation for how life began or how life goes on per se. I mean, you can describe certain features of it. You can describe the fact that it involves reproduction, for example. But, how did it get that way? Why is it reproducing? We don't know that. And so anyway, on the YouTube channel here, Danny Van Heck says, Hilma of Klimt has some cool art, in my opinion. And Sean says that he agrees. Or John Summer also, in his opinion, has some good art. And I just would say that Colleen Kibert, one of our artist friends, has commented about him of Klimt, and the show that she went to at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York on one occasion. And so she agrees with you too. I have to say that I'm not terribly familiar with Hilma of Klimt per se, but I can say that all of art is an expression of our lives, and you need a certain amount of creativity in your life. You need to be creating something, whatever it is. It can be, you can be creating dinner or creating the lives of your children or whatever it is. But you have to be creating, or you're going to not be in good mental health.
Well, and to speak to you, like you said, that's just not how life works, all scientific. And to speak to the multivariance of it, the old quote of, well, life is what passes you by while you're busy making too many plans. It's
that's right.
You've got to let the plans happen at speed. I mean, almost in a sense, it's like a race car driver. You've got a pit crew and an engineering crew, working behind the scenes, but you've got to be out there with you don't have to have the pedal to the metal, but you got to be out there doing it.
Right. And one of the most important things in my life is that I divorced my first wife and left the house when my oldest daughter was 12 and my youngest was 5. But I knew at a very deep level that if I wanted to have a relationship with my daughters later on in life, I didn't think this consciously at the time, but that I had to stay in contact with them. And so I made a very concerted effort over more than a decade following my departure to go and visit with them in a very deep way, at least once a month for all those years. And so I made more than 200, 400-mile trips just to spend the weekend with my daughters. And the result of that today is that my daughters are in their 40s, and I see no difference in how they treat me now and how we relate to one another now from when they were little girls. I mean, or how I would believe that they would be dealing with me in their 40s, even if I had stayed in the home. But that takes work and effort. But the sideshow or the side benefit of that is that I still have a relationship with my ex-wife. I still love her, something like a sister, I would say. And I have a respectful relationship with her new husband. And so it is possible to hold it together and not just fly off the handle and go away. And the reality is that, if you marry someone and have children with them, then even if you divorce them, you're never going to be able to rid yourself of them and their family, because every time there's a marriage or a death in the family, you're going to be in another event with them, whether you like it or not.
Well, and that's dadding level expert, because there may not have all been hearts and flowers, but the consistency of making sure that the connection, like a gardener, is tended, and that way that you can grow together,
right.
Literally.
Right. So anyway, and I
have to say, I love that story about life and parenting, simply because I think even in that one strata of your life, that expresses not only a goodness, but the eros that's living. And one of the reasons we're here, if we need a reason, it may not be a reason, but it certainly makes it worth it.
Yeah, it definitely makes it worth it. And of course, I was present for most of the big events of my daughters' lives, even long after I left the household where they were growing up. And as a result of that, we still have a close relationship today, and I'm very proud of that fact. Okay, now moving on with Jerry Wright. The reason that I put the quote back up on the screen, paragraph 367 of volume 67, or volume 10, is to point out that religions really provide and have provided an organically developed, or they have an organically developed psychotherapy for people over thousands of years.
Right.
And that has helped people quite a bit. It helps people see the other side of all of these things. And, prayer is a good thing. So is meditation, all those things. And all religions work this way. And so Jerry has taken a position. Jerry is a retired Presbyterian minister and a Jungian analyst. And he's taken a position that we need to walk away from the Abrahamic religions. And it's only on that one point that I differ from Jerry, and that is that, we have to have ways to teach our young. And when we're born, we're wild animals, and we all have to start from the beginning. And so, when we're born, it's just chaos. You don't know what's going on at all. There are bright lights. Somebody hits you on the bottom and causes you to scream, and you have no idea what's going on, right? And then some kindly goddess puts a nipple in your mouth, and that's the first time that you experience something that's warm and tasty and loving. And so we have to have ways to bring our children along. And I long ago realized that movies are basically our education system today, our movies and television programs. And so we're learning things all the time from movies and television programs. And that's why when I would visit my daughters on those weekends, very often I would take them to a movie, a new current movie, whatever it was. And because there are lessons that can be learned from movies, and so religions provide lessons in, as Jung says, mighty images that have been proven to work over thousands of years. And it's very much like the Tarot in a way, because the Tarot also is an education system. And for 600 years, it really hasn't changed at all in terms of the fundamental idea of Tarot and the main 78 characters of Tarot. There's been no change in 600 years, and that's because it's true. And it's true as a roadmap for life. And if you understand it if you understand it and follow it in that way, you can learn a lot. And
it also speaks to that a priori imaginal ego.
Right. And yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I got myself a new Tarot deck, which I'll just show you, because all men should go out and buy this deck. Okay, it's called the Dark Goddess Tarot, and it's by Ellen Lorenzi Prince.
Yeah, I know her personally, so she's it's.
And what Ellen has done is she has put a goddess around every one of the 78 cards, and I'm talking about the mythological goddesses, and she's basically describing the feminine principle. So if you're a man and you want to understand women a little bit, especially the dark side of women, get yourself a copy of this Tarot deck. If you don't want to play with the cards, fine, throw those away, but read her book.
Well, and her previous deck was the Tarot of the Crone, I think was her first deck. And that's just as powerful. But it's from a different perspective. And I love with the Dark Goddess Tarot, she's evolved everything she did in Tarot of the Crone. And it's worth it. It's definitely worth it.
But if you read that book and understand these 78 things, what I haven't worked out in my own mind yet, because I just got the deck a couple of days ago, but she calls it the Dark Goddess. And what I haven't worked out is whether this is only the shadow side of women, or it really touches on also the light side, the rational side of women. Maybe Jordan can tell me.
I think what I've come to with that is in a world attempting to force everyone to be an Eve of sorts, be Lilith. And, and I think that because Lilith, she doesn't care light or dark. She's going to fly those wings wherever she wants to go. And so that, to me, in a world that attempts to make you Eve, both men and women, be Lilith.
Yeah,
I think that's that dark goddess that I think Ellen Lorenzi Prince so wonderfully speaks to.
Right. But the question, Jordan, I'll say it again, is when she's explaining these cards, do you feel that she's, in the fullness of the whole deck, has she addressed the entire feminine principle or only the dark side?
Knowing Ellen, it's both, and even if she's focused on one, the other is going to be right there backing it up, even unsaid, in a sense like the unseen partner. Okay. I mean, it's to be fair to, I think,
it makes you think about the opposite, no matter what.
Right. And the contrast there is required. But I think what is the Dark Goddess Tarot, she's focused more on that dark. And I think in doing so, it magnetically induces us to bring the light for contrast to see the dark more clearly.
Okay, that's fair enough. And that's fair enough. And so for all men, I would say, I mean, we have plenty of tarot decks that are about the patriarchy and about the logos. But I've found very few that really address the feminine principle well. And this one does that. So for all young men who may be thinking you're going to get married soon and find a partner and make a family together and live a life together, you better read this book. I urge
Definitely.
you to read this book.
I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read this paragraph from Jerry now. So I'm on page 25 and I'm reading a mystical path less traveled, a Jungian psychological perspective by Jerry R. Wright. And these are journal entries of Jerry's. Perhaps the world is not only in our hands, but in our mouths. Words do create worlds. The three-tiered world created by the word God, referring to a theistic being, is no longer a world that can be inhabited by modern consciousness. God has become a lazy word employed when we don't want to do the difficult work of theological reflection. It is a throwaway word, as oh my God, OMG, oh my God, in the modern lexicon, or as blessing at the end of a sneeze. It will be an awkward, difficult transition. It will be an awkward, difficult transition to find and use words and images that preserve the mysteries at the heart of life without evoking the image of a supernatural male being. Furthermore, simply altering the gender by changing Father God to Mother God will not be enough, although that rather recent change has validated that our God images are undergoing an evolution. So, Jerry is finally speaking the obvious that most theologians must recognize at some level, maybe not consciously, but the fact is that all of our religions have been painting pictures of God outside of us, and they haven't addressed the God of the soul, the God of the psyche. And I mean both our personal God image and our collective God image and what that means. And so if you want to know what the dark side of the collective unconscious looks like, just go back and look at the images of our January 6th insurrection, where the dark side of that group of men got expressed, mostly men. That dark side of the collective unconscious got expressed in physical terms. And, we can't live that way. Civilization can't continue that way. And so we need to understand what drives us. And what happens in a mob like that is that there is a psychic epidemic that occurs. And as Dr. Jung explained, 100 admirable men in a room create one blockhead. Now, why is it?
That's, yeah.
So 100 admirable persons in a room create one blockhead. Now, what does that mean? It means that here we are, and we have a number of people watching on YouTube, and Jordan and I are here. And so we have a mini blockhead going because only Jordan and I are saying anything, and nobody else has really got their brain engaged. You're just listening and you're trying to learn what it is that we have to say. But the problem is that when you do that, you basically give up your agency, your autonomy to us, so that you're not making your own judgments necessarily. I mean, sometimes people do on the YouTube chat, but it isn't the same as seeing another person or making your own personal decisions. And so when you have a large group, a large mob, and you have one person up in front of you, whether admirable or not, that's screaming, let's all go down to the Capitol and make it wild, then everybody says, oh, what a good idea, let's go. And then what happens is each person takes the vibe off the other person, and pretty soon you're doing something that you would never do. Okay.
The flocky behavior, right.
Right. And so, you can see the dissociation of the people that were in the Senate chamber. They got in the Senate chamber, and then they didn't know what to do. They just didn't have an idea, because they respected the Senate. They loved the United States, these people, but they got drawn in by the crowd and the psychic epidemic to the point where there was no agency anymore. They were just drawn along by the crowd, and they see somebody beating up on a police officer, and then they say, oh, that's a good idea, let's beat up on a police officer, because that's the dark side, the shadow side that comes through, and you really don't have control of yourself. And so,
well,
let me just
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So there are evil people that know this. Okay. Donald Trump kept Mein Kampf on his bedstand for a reason for many years, because he was learning how Adolf Hitler did it. And if you can generate a mob like that, then you can cause great harm. And the difference between the United States, I mean, Jung made the comment that his one hope for the world was the Western democracies. Why? Because we have diversity in our country, and it means that not one group can control the rest. So in Adolf Hitler's time, 100 years ago, when he was in Landsberg prison writing Mein Kampf, all the men in Germany were pretty much the same. It was Weimar Germany. It was post-war Weimar Germany. They were resentful about the Treaty of
Versailles, right?
Versailles, right? The Treaty of Versailles, and so they all thought alike. And so when Adolf Hitler whipped up Weimar Germany, naturally they followed him, and he had whatever it was, 30 million men, all with one idea. But here we all have different ideas, and we have different interest groups. And so the result of that is, yes, you can have an eruption like January 6th, and that is uncontrollable. And you can see the psychic epidemic that ran through that crowd on that day, particularly. But, it's a psychic epidemic that was building up for 4 years, 5 years, maybe. But you see how civilization and society responds to that. Now there are a lot of those people that are going to spend 10 or 20 years in prison, and because civilization can't live that way. We can't have a society if people are going to go around with clubs and bear spray, and anytime they're not happy with you, they are going to spray you in the face. Well, that can't be. And so that's the significance of that idea. And so going back to Jerry now, I would say that in terms of teaching our young, we still do need the Abrahamic religions and all religions, depending on your society, as a way to teach young people basic morality. It's like elementary school. Think of it as elementary school, and it's a way to reiterate weekly how how you should behave in terms of God, whether it's your own God image or the collective unconscious, how you have to be respectful of that power that's there. And obviously there was the great power of evil was on display on January 6th. And so all the religions teach you to turn your back on that evil. And we need that teaching because we don't have a substitute for it. We can't just have people saying, oh, well, you have to meditate, or you have to, you have to go to Reformed Church of America, or you have to go to the other Reformed Church because they're slightly different in their catechism, or you have to go to the Roman Catholic Church, or you have to go to the Orthodox Catholic Church, and only then are you doing it right. Well, that's not true, okay? All of them are doing it right. All of them have learned over thousands of years how to teach the young about morality and about the other side of life. And so human beings can go back to any one of them and learn. And, we in the West, when we talk about the Abrahamic religions, we have a service once a week, but Muslims think that they should reiterate this idea 5 times a day. And there's nothing wrong with that idea. That's a good idea, to draw yourself out of the chaos of your life and just meditate on that chaos. And if you're practiced at doing that over a lifetime, you're going to live a much more successful life. And so anyway, I don't think we can turn our backs on the Abrahamic religions, and that's the only point. I mean, Jerry says we have to go to psychology. Well, yes, this is psychology, I agree. And this YouTube channel is called Carl Jung Deb Psychology Reading Group for a reason, okay? But it doesn't mean that it needs to be a religion. It actually operates that way, but it also means that we can go back to our traditional religion, whatever it is in our family, and have a new respect for it. So I often say that, I was losing it in the Christian religion. Okay. When I was 30, I had been a deacon in the Reformed Church of America, and I was doing all the movements. I was going through all the wickets of the Reformed Church, but it wasn't connecting very well to my life. I do acknowledge that when I went to services, I would feel better afterwards. So it was unconsciously having an effect on me. But otherwise, I was like most American men, or most American men. They say, well, there's no God up there. There's no God down there, or no devil down there. So, these myths are just untrue, but that's not true. Okay, they are true, but they're true in a different universe. And that's the universe of the psyche. But I didn't know that at the time. So I went through, 20 or 30 years where there was no connection with that. And it was only by reading Jung assiduously that I started to understand that. So we can't just turn it off. And we have to have a ladder by which we can come up and understand ourselves. And that is offered by all the religions of the world. And so when fundamentalists say the Bible is 100% true, I say, yes, it is 100% true. And so is the Quran, and so is the Bhagavad Gita. And so are all the religious texts of the world. They're all true. And they're all true for the psyche, which is where they have impact anyway. And so that's what we have to start understanding. Jung correctly wailed that, we have no idea how our psyche really works. And we have to start understanding that. So Jordan, your turn to talk for a minute. I'll look at a couple of comments here.
That's it's important. I think with for example, the January 6th riot behavior, that insurrection piece, but also the larger scale cultural psychosis that's going on. And there's a lot of nods to all the negative trauma-born behaviors and environments that are causing this. But sociologically, I've been kind of looking around a little more dispassionate, forensic way. And something I find of note for us to take note of is, I think it was 1973, the empathy movement kind of really got traction from a psychological perspective, and empathy began to be promoted. And I think we're also now seeing that there's a dark side to empathy, that initially it was the can't we all get along, listen to your brother or sister, and so to speak, and don't worry about agreement or disagreement, but hear the other side. And that was good. And people started to actually have more strength and less being afraid. Their fear could be radar. And so then you get the system almost over time, immediately, mixing, except that over time, we naturally refer each other. Oh, I think you should meet this person. And what happens is the pendulum swings, and after a while, you're bringing people over, red over, let Skip come over kind of thing. But then I introduce you to someone else, and you introduce me to someone else. And little by little, the pendulum comes back to actually put more of us who think the same together. And it's not always, but I find that then the flocking behavior still functions through the empathy piece to actually kind of spit out a dark side of empathy. That's not a reason not to have it, but I think it's also culpable. And I think just as big as the pepper spray and the abusive environments, that I think goes hand in hand, so we can see more clearly how to actually, if I was Abraham Lincoln, how to wrestle this thing.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple of comments here on the YouTube chat that I'd like to address. One is from Danny Van Heck. I'm going to start with that, even though it's the last one. He said, any opinions about Rudolf Steiner? His claims about Atlantis seem a bit too fantastical to me.
I feel Rudolf Steiner. Go ahead.
For my part, I'm going to give this to you in a minute, Jordan. Okay, for my part, I have not read any Rudolf Steiner. I know that he's some sort of philosopher somewhere out there in the ether, and so I don't know what his theories of Atlantis are. What I interpret is that Atlantis may well have been Santorini and the human civilization that was in Santorini at the time of the great volcanic eruption that destroyed the island and
sank it.
And that Santorini also provided the impetus to cause the 10 plagues that appear in Exodus. So that's my opinion, and it's worth absolutely nothing. You have to make your own choices, but I would urge you to look up on Wikipedia the three theories of where the 10 plagues came from. And one of the theories is the explosion of Santorini in like 500 BC or 400 something BC. And I think it's very likely that early Iron Age men experiencing what happened after that volcanic eruption wouldn't have understood what was going on. But today, scientists can say, well, this is probably what was going on. So I'm persuaded by that, although obviously we'll never know. So you want to speak to Steiner, and then I'll go back to the other point.
Yeah, and I think I look at Steiner in a larger scale way. I haven't looked at his views on Atlantis enough to actually want to say one way or the other, but I have looked at him enough to go, I don't know. But the biggest thing to me with Rudolf Steiner is the creation of the Waldorf School, which is an experiential learning system. That to me is good. And so I look at Rudolf Steiner as the Waldorf School is what I really find value in. And then his theories of Atlantis, those are personal and kind of none of my business. And so in that sense, that's the way I look at it, because I don't want to dismiss the Waldorf School because I'm really skeptical about what he said about Atlantis. Because I think when you go into Santorini and the 10 plagues, from an architectural engineering perspective, tectonic plate movement, seismic zones, Santorini is a huge forensic story that tells a lot about the 10 plagues in regards to when you disappear that large of a thing at one time. It's a percentage of the whole ecosystem of the world, and nature abhors a vacuum, and it will fill it pretty quick.
Yeah.
So that's my kind of 2 cents on Rudolf Steiner.
Okay, now I want to go back to Daniel Mullen's comment, and the part I want to address is that this channel is incredibly informative. One of the only sources of information about the process of individuation for women, not much info about that idea. And so besides Diane Croft's book, which we're reading in series here, I do want to again refer all men to this book and women to The Dark Goddess by Ellen Lorenzi Prince. And you can get the tarot cards too, but that's not to me, that's not the most significant thing about this book. What the most significant thing about this book is that what Ellen has done here is she has described in 78 discussions, let's say, the dark side of women. And and as Jordan said earlier, it also therefore touches the light side. But
Right.
When I get a new book, I normally open it to one page and consider it important, whatever I open to. And so the one I open to, and I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about, is what I open to is this one, Sovereignty, the Morrigan. And you can see the image that she's put into this book. And
she's using, that's the number 4, which is traditionally the emperor. So there's the Morrigan as the sovereign.
Right. And so we could think of Morgan Le Fay in the Arthurian myth, because Morgan Le Fay is always the nemesis of King Arthur, right? And so, but let me read what Ellen has said here. She says it's the Celtic goddess of the blood, and never surrender what matters most. Okay, so that's the point. So she says right here across the bottom, never surrender what matters most. And she's got a lot of skulls here and so on. Okay, so let me just.
It's interesting that symbol on the stele on the stone is somewhat similar to Diane Croft's. It's
yeah, very much so. Okay, so in a normal tarot deck, as Jordan correctly points out, obviously, the number 4 major arcana is the emperor. But in this deck, which is all about women and the dark side of women, the number 4 card is sovereignty, and it's called the Morrigan. Okay, so let me just read what Ellen says here. The Morrigan is the Celts' great queen. I'm sorry. The Morrigan is the Celts' great queen, the supreme goddess of a vigorous and successful tribe. She provides for the needs of her people through her powers of fertility, magic, and warfare. Fond of the battlefield, she wears the shape of a crow or raven as she picks over the fallen and prophecies. I'm sorry, I have to read that again. Fond of the battlefield, she wears the shape of a crow or a raven as she picks over the fallen and prophesies their doom. She terrifies her enemies with the dread appearance of her naked, tattooed army. She leads her warriors to victory against an overwhelming odds. Prophesying after a battle, she speaks of peace, peace to the sky, strength in everyone. The peace of the goddess is achieved by power, vigilance, and the willingness to shed blood, one's own and another's. The Morrigan, who may also be called Morgu or Morgan, appears in triplicate as well as in a singular manifestation. She is the trinity of Thea, hateful, Babd, fury, and Macha, battle, to show her ferocious and terrifying strength. She is maiden, mother, and crone to show that her power spans the full experience of life, from the cradle to the grave and back again. She is a great healer and shapeshifter, for all the plants and animals of her land are valued, understood, protected, and claimed as her own. The great queen commands the kings of her tribe to exercise firm and rightful powers in the leadership of the people and the protection and prosperity of their land. Those who do not recognize her do not receive her blessing. The mate of the Morrigan is the Dagda, the good god, the god of the fertile earth and the father of his people, and a master of magic in his own right. When the goddess mounts him for her pleasure, the earth, fruits, and flowers. When they couple on All Hallows Eve at the sacred ford, portals open between the worlds, taking souls from the living or returning souls from death, for her power reaches into all of the realms. So I think that's a very powerful 3 paragraphs there, but it really reflects what a woman at leading her tribe, if that tribe is her family, let's say, the types of things that she must master and control in her life. And a lot of them are not talked about. And so therefore, for women, I think that this is a great sort of a recipe for individuation, I suppose, especially if you understand the tarot and understand the significance of the number 4 card in the major arcana, the emperor, and understand why the Morrigan is in sovereignty in the number 4 card in this deck. But just as a general matter, it wouldn't be bad for a man to own this book, the Dark Goddess, and to understand the 78 goddesses that Ellen Lawrence Prince is talking about here. So I'll just make that comment. That's an aside, though. That's not our main reading here. Um, Kushbu's here. Hi, Kushbu. She says, "Good Lord, this feels like me." Kushbu, I hope you can get a copy of this tarot in India, because this is a terrific book. But I know if I try to send it to you, it'll cost me $250 or something. So anyway, maybe you can find it somehow online. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. I'm reading The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious by Diane Croft. And we're on the second reading of the day. And the second reading is entitled Flying. And so first, the poem that was given to Diane. I was flying too high. I was soaring over the meadow, the sun on my back, the wind beneath my wing, a faithful black raven stirring below. A crack like thunder, flapping and squawking, shot off pieces dropping like stone, a familiar black raven rising to greet me. And so here's the image that Diane has selected. Black raven, a head and claws. And the name of the painting is Common Raven from Reports of Explorations and Surveys, 1859. And the quote is from Edinger, Ego and Archetype. Myth tells us that inflation has, as its inevitable consequence, a fall. And then Diane's comment here. Flying. This poem contains a brutal, disturbing image, but I remember feeling comfortable with it, which is implied in a familiar black raven rising to greet me. I wasn't sure how to approach this dichotomy until I hit upon a passage in Edward Edinger's Ego and Archetype that talks about the psychological process of dismemberment. Quote, where the ego is still largely identified with the self, the original unconscious wholeness needs to be broken up to submit to dismemberment, unquote. At this stage, I was clearly identified with the self. I was flying too high and not yet aware of the autonomous spirit within. So at this stage, the original unconscious totality of the psyche must be broken up so that the self can be experienced as a psychic force separate from the ego, the I. Otherwise, the ego unconsciously usurps the power of the self and believes itself omnipotent. But Edinger adds that dismemberment can mean different things at different stages of the process. Quote, at this stage, the separation of the ego from the shadow is required if the whole personality is not to fall into the unconscious, that is, go to hell. Certainly, there is a strong image of falling in the poem, but also an awareness of a separate shadow figure staring below. Okay, so I'll just remind everyone of the time that one of my daughters told me she thought I was going to hell. I don't think she meant it in quite this way, but I'm going to excuse myself for a bio break and let Jordan talk here. So I'll be right back.
Well, that whole impetus of that which is below, the depth, the hell. Jung has a wonderful quote that a tree cannot reach, or a tree cannot grow to heaven unless its roots grow to hell or reach to hell. And the metaphor there is simply that you have the dark and the light. The more intense it gets one way or the other, the further you go into the light, the more you reach the dark. And the more you go into the dark or the darkness or the depth or the thonic realms, the more you get to the light. And there's the whole yin yang symbol, where if you look at the black dot in the white field and then the white dot in the black field, they end up both being somewhat portals or wormholes back to the capital O other. So that if you go so far into the dark, you see the white dot and you zip back to the white. And in that sense there, going so far into the dark, Carl Jung might say, go as far as you can into the depths and then cast out further and yank the glowing-eyed fish from the deep. And that right there is the metaphor, even the story of Daedalus and Icarus tells, where Icarus, the son, builds his own wings. Daedalus, the dad, is an architect and has built his wings very fittingly. But the son, Icarus, builds his wings with wax. And so when he flies too high without the abilities developed in his structure, his wings fall apart because the wax melts. So I think that Skip was speaking to that line of thinking of the dark not just being as important as the light, but they're both together. So that the Daedalus Icarus story there, as well as Jung yanking the glowing-eyed fish from the deep, just like the yin yang symbol, you go so far into the dark, cast further, you catch that white dot and you yank the glowing-eyed fish from the deep. And when you get to that white dot, you zip right back over to the white field, go so far into the light. Icarus went too close to the sun, and he did not have the authoritative discipline borne by all of the hard work that his dad, Daedalus, the architect, had fittingly put his wings together with. And so he used wax, inexperience then brought his fall.
So I think we have a poster boy for the inflated ego in the form of our ex-president, who, thinks everything is about him and just can't cope with the fact that most Americans voted him out of office. And it goes to the old saying, the higher they fly, the harder they fall. Mm-hmm. And so we're only beginning to see the fall of this deflated ego. I don't even know if he can survive it, honestly. And I don't mean because anybody will do something to him, but only that his psyche is going to have to balance so hard that I don't know if he can manage it.
And I would say, speaking to that directly psychologically, at 42, astrologically, Neptune transits your natal Neptune, and it's the midlife crisis. It's the place where most psych professionals say that if you have not started to deal with these things by 42, they fast become baked in, because the Neptune, its fluidity, Poseidon, all of that in the myth, it starts to solidify like Jello at first, but then like granite, and then like concrete, and it cures, and it's baked in. And getting that out requires literally a lot of demolition, which is hard work. And with him, you get a child who's born of a monster of a father, and I will not call him a dad, a monster of a father, and a doormat of a mother. And so his little ego, full of light and whatever, ran unchecked. And that's the Icarus that somehow had the magical wax, kept it all together, and just kept trying to push higher and higher. Except there's a point where he's just circling like a vulture over his own dead, and he can't get anywhere.
Well, and so we've started to see the beginnings of the fall. It's going to be unfolding over the next couple of years, of course, but
right.
The images in the past week of his airplane that has his name emblazoned across it is now in some airport in Long Island, where it's got one engine out and it's over in the corner and it's unflyable at this point, and he's not putting any money in it. And, that's just symbolically addresses the issue of his collapse.
Well, and look at that
psychological
plane.
collapse.
When you see that image of the plane, all I thought was, oh, look at Icarus. The big feather fell out of the wing. One
Right.
whole wing fell off. And
Right.
that's the fall of Icarus in the image of that plane right there. Except that there is no Daedalus with him.
Right.
That's the thing. There's no mentor in the tormentor.
And you have to be able to rebuild yourself. In other words,
Right.
We see him putting off the certification of his airplane. And so it's like all of us put off things that we find untasteful. Like I was putting off my taxes, and I didn't want to get into the taxes. And in point of fact, with TurboTax or some other electronic tax system, I can do my taxes in about 4 or 5 hours without too much difficulty, including both my wife's business and my various income sources and expenses, which my expenses exceed my income, but nonetheless, I have income from some of my students who follow me. And I have also enormous expenses. For example, this Zoom channel cost me $174 a month to be able to offer a Zoom channel that can take actually 100 panelists and 500, I guess it's now 1,000 attendees. And so that alone is a big expense. And so I'm not complaining, mind you, but the point is that if you're putting off your taxes, or you're putting off something that's painful, whatever it is, I mean, that you just don't want to do. I don't want to brush my teeth, or I don't want to vacuum the floor and wash the kitchen floor. Those are things that are painful, and we want to put them off. And certainly it's physically painful to me every time I vacuum the floor, because I have joint replacements. I gave my legs for my country, so so you put those things off, and so we see a sign of that in the fact that that our ex-president's inflation is retracting, because he's not putting time and money into his airplane so that he can fly it around and play the big man again. And I think that we're going to see many more symbolic signs of the bursting of his balloon over the coming year, 2 years probably. And that also relates to the people that attacked the Capitol on January the 6th, because they got themselves totally inflated, thinking that Trump was going to come to their assistance and they could do whatever they wanted to. That was a huge inflation also. And all of a sudden now, once that balloon got punctured, now they're having trouble getting their mind around the fact that, oh, by the way, this kind of behavior where you're murdering a police officer and you're assaulting police officers and destroying property, we don't approve of that in this civilization, in our society. And we have laws about that, and they're felonies, and you're going to spend a lot of time in jail because of this. And they will get their minds around it at some point, perhaps. One never knows. But in the case of our former president, I doubt that he's ever going to accept the fact that he was inflated, and recognize the humility he has to bring in order to be president again. I mean, he thinks he can be elected again, and that's just not possible.
Well, and when that balloon popped, the cat herder went away. you know, and they were in charge in the first place, pretty much. He's token figurehead, except they look to him out of a false sense of support because the mentor is gone, and he's not a good mentor. But when he's up there in the limelight, they don't discern the difference. Right. There's just he's not a leader, but he is their one who leads. Yeah. That they look to for that, though he's not doing it in an effective way.
They've been surprised multiple times. One, he didn't come to their support on January 6th. Secondly, he didn't take the oath of office on January 20th. And third, he didn't take the oath of office on March 4th or whatever their
the fictional
their fantasy about
it's
how
on paper, but that's never going to occur. It's
not at all. And so
it's like a different electoral college. It's there, but
it's not going to work.
Right.
And so these are all pinpricks in a giant inflated balloon that is gradually coming down, and people have to recognize it. And to those of you who might be supporters of the ex-president, I would, I'd read the myth of Daedalus and Icarus.
Right. and March 4th technically that's really on the books as the anomalous potentiality of a military coup that's actually supported, but that's not how this country operates. I think actually company is probably a better word, but this country operates.
Right. And so, when March 6th or January 6th happened, it happened that we were in our advanced reading group at that time, live on video.
Debbie brought the notices.
Yeah, Debbie, my wife, brings in the headlines of what's going on at the Capitol, and all of a sudden, everybody in the group was just panicking, and it was actually explicitly said, well, what if the army comes out and supports Trump? And I said, no, they won't. That's not going to happen at all. Mm-hmm. And I've spent my whole life with the U.S. military, and I know in the deepest part of my bones that the U.S. military would never do that. I'm not saying that there aren't elements of the U.S. military that are rotten. There certainly are some, and former General Flynn is a perfect example of that, although he's been pardoned now by our former president. But by and large, we train our officers extremely well, and in my case, I only raised to the fifth from the bottom officer rank, which was lieutenant colonel. But in the course of doing that, I took the oath of office 7 times, and I swore my oath every time to the Constitution of the United States and not to an individual man. And I went to Vietnam, even though I didn't agree with the political policy that was Vietnam. I still went to Vietnam and did my service in a patriotic way. And and I served 23 years in the Marines and have the legs to prove it. But the point is there's something larger than the individual, and mm-hmm. I never swore my oath to an individual, and it never dawned on me that it was possible that anybody was swearing an oath to an individual. And so while there can be anomalies in any organization, and a few of them were in play on January 6th, but I knew that there wasn't going to be a coup d'etat in the United
Right.
States, not at all. And so,
Well, even from a gardening perspective, 10 to 20%, you expect rot. Well, and you cut it out and you use it as compost. And I mean, a concept I have is deadheading the pansies. Pansies are, and I mean, not pansies like goes down like a daisy weekly, people. It's like, the pansies are really intensely colorful flowers. They're very delicate, but they're really hardy. But if you don't pop the spent flowers off, they will just go into a gooey mess. But if you just daily deadhead the pansies, pop the flowers off, they are the most bright, vibrant, strong things. And there's the military. They take care of not allowing rot.
yeah.
I mean, in a bigger picture, and like there's 10% of problems in every group. I mean, don't the one bad apple, don't let the one bad apple spoil the group,
So there's a comment here which is interesting from Abraxas. Okay.
Nice Jungian name.
Yeah, and he says the best leader is subservient, and that reminds me of
your story.
Something that Frank Burns told me one time. Frank Burns actually lived. Was a Frank Burns,
and not the one on MASH.
Not the one on MASH. And Frank Burns was a colonel in the Army, and he was the head of Delta Force in the Army. And Delta Force, in this case, wasn't the special operators, but rather Delta, as in change right. In the Army. The man who was changing the culture of the Army, and he was a Jungian, and he did many great things. He was an amazing man. But one of the things he used to say is, "There go my people. I must follow them."
Right.
And so that's right on Abraxas's.
Well, and even to support that further, if you look at a pack of wolves, the alpha does not lead. The beta is in the front. And if you look at any aerial photograph of a wolf pack, there's the pack, the alpha, the beta is up front. And then 3 or 4 lengths back, the alpha brings up the rear, because he can see everything that everyone else sees. Instead of letting them get picked off, he has a view of the safety of the group.
Right. And Martin makes this comment: I wouldn't agree with subservient, more king, like in that the kingdom is regenerative. And that brings up some experiences of mine. For example, I lived for 5 months in Vietnam with a Sergeant E5, and I was a first lieutenant, and we lived in a hole in the ground in a bunker that had been actually built by the French. And when we were down in that bunker, our relationship was Jerry and Skip, Skip this, Jerry that. But when we came up out of the bunker, there was never any question about who was in charge. And so, you have to have a certain amount of humility to be a leader. I could have been down in that bunker and behaved like an asshole, and I could well have gotten a bullet in the back of the head at some point,
right?
Because if you're trying to behave like that, then you're not going to control the situation. But if if you want to have a relationship with someone, you have to have a relationship with that person, right. And that involves a certain amount of humility in any relationship. And it's not always, I'm in charge, I'm the big boss here, and you got to follow me. That isn't the way it works. And I think that's why many men end up getting blown out of marriages one way or another because they think they're the big boss of a relationship that is dual and requires both sides to be heard from.
Well, and nature knows no control. Nature only has weather. Nature doesn't need order. Nature doesn't need plans. It lives, and that's I think speaks directly to the leadership of how to swim, for example, in relationship, or in that bunker hole you lived in. I mean, there's a place there where there's an ecosystem that is different, for example, inside, like you said, than outside, and
Right.
you oscillate between the two with fluidity and flexibility and directness too.
And there's a reason for the failure of the Trump presidency, and that is that he skipped all the wickets. In other words, he didn't serve in the various levels of government as most people do. And so he never experienced the way to move this monolith, which is the US government. He never really knew how he could move it in a proper way. And so he couldn't lead. And I just remember an editorial from the Wall Street Journal one time, or it was an op-ed where a guy was talking about being in Vietnam, and he was a Marine, and his captain was killed. And he said he couldn't say how fearful he became, because he said, I was counting on that man to get me home alive. And the reason he was counting on that was because a captain in the Marine Corps is a highly trained officer and with a lot of experience, several years of experience. And so he knows how to handle a situation, whereas a private, an 18-year-old private, has no clue what to do. And so you have to rely on the old man. The old man might only be 3 or 4 years older than you, but he has a lot more information and he has a lot more experience. And so the truth is that we train all of our Marines right up, so that when that captain was killed, there was probably a first lieutenant who was the executive officer of that company and would have been able to step into that role as captain and as company commander. But a young Lance Corporal or PFC doesn't necessarily know that. And so that's why when he was in Vietnam, he became extremely apprehensive and fearful when his captain was killed. In war, people do get killed, but, we train all the way up. And so we rely on that training and experience that these senior officers have at every level. And, you have to know that all that experience is there behind those leaders. And so the flaw in Donald Trump is he skipped all those wickets. He was born with a golden spoon in his hand, in his mouth, and every time he did something bad, everybody, he would just bully people and get away with it, and he got away with it all the way up.
Little Lord Fauntleroy.
Yeah, so he never had the experience necessary to actually be a leader.
And a good example, I think, Skip, in support of that in a more smaller scale is psychiatry and pharmacological solutions. I mean, what do? The first thing they do is they prescribe you something, and then they start the work. Well, quick fixes have shallow roots. The military example you had there is long form, continuous discipline. You have the tools because you have trained them, It's like any shaman will not give someone any kind of natural substance if they don't know that they can take it. And the only way to take it is to do the work. So even with LSD experience now, I'm kind of thinking, oh, it's just a new psychiatry. Quick fixes have shallow roots. The people do not have the tools to basically be able to experience those intense conditions psychologically, and actually have them do anything other than, a flash in the pan of a mystical experience today. But then that has no basis in their normal daily life. They have nothing to compare it to. And it either washes them away or potentially creates addiction. They want that again because their life does not have it. But the thing is, without all the discipline, breath work and physical discipline and psychological work, those quick, drug fixes have very shallow roots most oftentimes.
Right. And we have mystical experiences every day, but most people don't recognize them. And what we're about here is about recognizing them. I can point to something every single day of my life without fail. And usually more than one.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes, yes, sometimes a daydream is just some rest. And sometimes a daydream is a theosophic vision, a big, huge awake dream.
Sure. And so, I've been working this patch of turf, this reading group, for 5 years. And, if you had been following it since June 1st, 2016, you'd have a pretty solid idea of what Dr. Jung meant by individuation and what the significance of his work has to do with religion and so on. But you can't just come to one video and grok it. Okay. In other words, it's something that you have to get over a period of time. And, I will readily admit that, a lot of what I know about Jungian psychology today, I've learned in the last 5 years, even though I've been doing it for 33 years. It just takes a long time to understand it. And so we can talk about these things. Jordan can talk about Rudolf Steiner all he wants. And, it will wash right off your back unless you have a context for it. And so that's why we talk about examples from life, because those examples from life give you a context to understand what these things are about. And this is why on Monday nights we talk about the tarot, because the tarot represents many of the things, maybe 80% of the things that you might ever run into in life. And so if you study the tarot, you're going to see how things interact in life. But you can't just, read a book like a novel and think that you're going to, okay, now I know what the tarot is, and so I'm going to go on to something else. No, it doesn't work that way. And
even the reverse. I didn't read a book for the first 16 years of reading. The cards just told me stories. So, and that's the whole point. And at the same time, I'm in a similar boat, so to speak, with Jung, and discovering him in 1991, and prior to that, had been steeped in Alan Watts and a lot of similar things. But psychology wasn't really something in an academic household. They were anti that in a way.
Right.
But I feel like I've filled the Jung ocean for the last 30 years, and in the last 4 to 6, I swim in it, and it's in my life. But I look back thinking, there was all this knowledge I was sponging and all these concepts that were so natural. But I literally don't think I got past the 1, 2, 3, 4 cha-cha dance steps, until 5 or so years ago, and I'm in a similar way.
So Danny says on the YouTube chat, of course, I can't be sure of that, but guess it's not unreasonable to think there's a good chance Trump is just a born sociopath. Well, I don't concur with that.
And actually, psychopaths are born. Sociopaths are typically made from trauma. To split a hair there, but psychopaths are born.
I don't think. Well, all right.
There's a whole.
I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm not going to split that here. But what I would say is that Donald Trump was born into a toxic environment in his family,
right?
And he learned to be a sociopath, and you know, what more can I say about it? But
and that he would learn to be a sociopath as an actual legitimate psychological defense mechanism for survival.
Sure, in that toxic environment.
In that that toxic environment.
And so I can feel sorry for him. I can, years ago, back when he was first elected, it was very obvious to me that he was so inflated. And I was just thinking, boy, the bigger you are, the harder you're going to fall. And we may not have seen the end of it yet. I mean, Hitler had a 23-year run, and 10 years after he was in Landsberg prison, he was elected by the German people with the biggest majority to be Chancellor of Germany of anyone else for years and years. It's only Angela Merkel that beat him later, in terms of the largest majority later on. But the reality is that we have a lot more people carrying pins to stick in the balloon in the United States. I mean, that's the point of Jung's belief in the Western democracies, in the sense that we do have diversity, and when people get inflated, they get their bubble popped usually, and occasionally one gets through, and that was our experience in the last 4 years. But now we're going to see that the denouement of that.
Yeah, the denouement. It's interesting to me. An exercise I use with people in regards to how to see Trump is turn the sound off and just watch him. And within about 30 seconds, you'll watch someone the tongue comes out. I'm like, so you just got the bad taste in your mouth, didn't you? Yeah. He hasn't said anything. You're watching him. And what happens is you get the micro tells around the eyes, you get his gestures, and you literally, viscerally, naturally, with no experience, start to feel this person is lying. And you can tell it non-verbally and without the sound. And what's interesting to me is oftentimes someone will get a real barb in their solar plexus, and they'll pass it off as, oh, that's just me, or I'm not, whatever. It's like, no, that's danger. That's nature saying you are in danger. Yeah, take note.
I remember when I was 5 years old, I was in kindergarten in Kodiak, and there was this one counterpart of mine who was always lying. And when he lied, I would literally see a light upon his face, and I would see a certain expression, which you call tells, but I was seeing it when he was 5 years old, and I would instantly know he was lying. And I didn't, at the time, of course, I was 5 years old too, so I didn't really grok what all that meant, but I was literally having a vision of this guy's face lighting up in a certain way when he told a lie. And whenever I saw that, I knew that he was lying.
And then you would remember that as a forensic, that even if you didn't conceptualize it as a 5-year-old, your natural inner animal went, oh yeah, I remember that.
Right. And so now when I'm 74, I look back on that and say, yeah, that was a numinous experience for me.
Yeah, very definitely.
And one that I really know about. So anyway, moving on, Danny says, by that I mean he misses something in his brain that makes him incapable to feel empathy. I wouldn't know about that, Danny. I'm not a mental health professional, so
I think it skipped. You said
I don't
it.
want to opine on that point.
Yeah.
What
As I say, you said it. He was born into a toxic environment, and just, I'm not a psychological professional either, but I have seen, and most people in the world have seen, the direct effect that trauma will have on someone that often decades later it takes to come out, but it scar tissues responses, and the external world becomes a threat.
Right. And the history of the former president's family is quite well known in the public wheel. So we know what it was like, and all of us know in our hearts that if we had been born into that environment, we would have done the same thing.
Basically, born into prison camp with money.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I want to go on with Jerry Wright's book here, because we're running out of time, and I at least want to get through one more. And so Jerry Wright says, yesterday I was thinking that rather than writing about the monotheistic myth and God image having died, perhaps it would be more palatable to readers to say that it has proven to be inadequate or insufficient. However, for me, that would be a cop-out. It would represent that predictable stage of grief, the bargaining stage. No, the myth and the God image have died. We must provide them with an appropriate funeral, offer heartfelt eulogies, and bury them. Nothing short of death will permit resurrection. Many self-identified progressive or liberal theologians and authors seem to walk close to the edge of the gravesite and then retreat. The retreat comes in the form of repeating traditional references to God as an external, separate being. I can appreciate the hesitation. A lifetime of work and writing may be called into question, as well as the dismissal from religious authorities. Yet facing that question with the courage of newly found conviction might be a deeper witness to faith, trust, than pleasing salutes to audiences or religious authorities. And so this journal entry is in the essence of what our problem is, because I do agree with Jerry that we have to have a funeral for the way God was taught, or religion was taught, in the last 2,000 years. When Friedrich Nietzsche said God is dead, and we have killed him, he already was speaking for the vast majority of people in Western Europe and vast majority of men today. The God of the Abrahamic religions does not exist. It never existed. It was a way for early Iron Age men to somehow describe what was going on psychologically in a metaphorical manner, and it's become concretized. But that, we human beings have created all the religions and all the ways of pointing to the ineffable, and that the God as it has been taught in the Abrahamic religions is dead. We have to recognize that. That's no longer something that we should be teaching. But what I say is that Nietzsche said God is dead, and Jung came along in the next generation. He found the living God, where he lives, and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And we've had it right here today in these two two readings because Diane talked about Mother Nature and how nature doesn't care about whether you're traumatized or whether it wipes out a village or something like that. There's no Geppetto up there saving us from ourselves and our stupidity. But we now physically represent the God that they were imagining 2,000 years ago or 3,500 years ago when
chapter 5 of Ion.
Say it again.
Chapter 5 of Ion,
Right.
The self. And I mean, even Nietzsche to Jung, if I look at cycles in a garden, I don't mourn the dahlias. I don't mourn the passing of the lilies. I mean, they come up and they go down. And I think God died into us in a way. And so you get these 2,000-year cycles. And then you get Nietzsche.
Well, and it's hard to deal with.
Goes into Jung.
Right. And as Jerry indicates, it's hard to deal with the propaganda. And, at one point years ago, when I first ran into Paul Vanderklay, who's a famous Reformed minister in Sacramento and who has done a lot of YouTube work, when I first ran into him and I saw that he was sort of enamored with Jordan Peterson, and he was trying to understand what Jordan Peterson was doing and how that could help him, because he was saying, geez, we're losing people in the church, and Jordan's able to fill an auditorium for his talks. And, what are we doing wrong? And the answer to that is very simple, which is that Jordan is giving explanations that people can get their minds around, as Jerry is here,
right,
in the logos. But Paul, because he's a Reformed pastor and this is his profession, he can't really fight City Hall. He still has to teach the Abrahamic tradition and the Christian tradition in the way that he was taught to teach it. And with all it's this creed and not that guy's creed type stuff. And
that's a really good point.
He's stuck. He can't get out of that as long as he's going to be practicing as a minister in the Reformed Church. And this is the problem that Jerry had. Jerry was a professional Presbyterian minister. And as long as he was practicing as a Presbyterian minister, he had to be and act out the role of Presbyterian minister, and he could not say these things. Now that he's retired and sees both his ministry and his Jungian analyst roles side by side, he can say that, that way of teaching what we need to teach about, which is the psyche itself and how the psyche itself works, that can't be taught by pointing to God up here and pointing to the devil down here. It can only be taught by pointing to the heart and the psyche, not to things that are myths. They're stories. They're stories to help us sort of understand. And for people, human beings, as we were evolving over those 3,500 years, that's what we kind of needed, because I'm sure that Job had those visions that he had. Okay, they were visions, and I've had these kinds of visions also, right, in my direct experience. I literally had Mephistopheles sit down in my car next to me one time, only for a few seconds, but holy smokes, when something like that happens, how do you explain it? Well, okay, pastors have a way to explain that, and And, they would say, well, you better get yourself close to church and get yourself close to God and start paying in the collection plate, or Mephistopheles is going to come back and get you again, right? And fortunately, when that happened to me, I had already been studying Jungian psychology for a decade, and so I knew that it was a vision coming from my deep unconscious, because the Mephistopheles that I saw was the Mephistopheles that I had imagined when I read Faustus in college.
Right.
And so, there he was. And yes, he was quite real, but he was a vision. He wasn't in the physical world. and so we need to understand that is how the psyche works. And that's the significance of Jungian psychology, which is the Jungian psychology is about how the psyche really works. It's not about what some statistician thinks.
Right.
And it's not about a myth. And so it isn't that the religions are bad. They're good in terms of being a training ground, an elementary school, if you will. And it's not that the Masonic lodges and the Knights of Columbus are bad. Those are, as Dr. Jung said, that's a middle level where the organization helps you. That's like middle school, okay, where
Right.
in middle school you're relying on an organization to bring you along, and that too is a collective unconscious thing, like the 100 men in a room, right?
Yeah, the blockhead.
Right. Making one blockhead, but they're crutches for the lame, right? That's what they amount to, these organizations. But if you're going to make it through high school and into college, then you're going to have to do your own study and understand it for yourself. And
you bring up a good point with like Paul Vanderklay about, you doesn't want to go fight City Hall, so to speak. It reminds me of being in a mediation chamber, and a younger attorney came up, and he just, pesky idealism written all over it, and he's going in. And I said, I'm not an attorney, but I'm going to give you a little piece of advice. You're going to fight City Hall. Don't forget, you're doing it in City Hall. So,
yeah, right.
so just keep that in mind.
Yeah. So I continue to this day listen to Paul Vanderklay's videos, and Paul is a searching individual. He's a very well-meaning individual in terms of what he's trying to do, but he and the funny thing is, he did a video about a week and a half ago saying that can Jordan Peterson cross the line? And the line he was talking about was the line between the logos, psychology logos, and belief. Okay, but Paul himself can't cross the line, which is the line between the conscious and the unconscious, and understanding that belief isn't going to do it anymore. Okay, and that if people are going to be religious and be part of a church or anything else, they're going to have to know in the sense that Dr. Jung was talking about. And that's a further step in it's a fifth stage of consciousness that we're gradually coming into, and people don't understand it. So Jung in his lifetime, because he was born into the church and his whole family were churchmen, he couldn't explicitly say what he was about. He did only late in his life in a few letters to theologians, but he couldn't, it was very difficult for him during all of his writing to really say what it was that he was trying to say. And so he attacked it in many, many different ways. And ultimately, I got it. I mean, I didn't read his work for 2 decades because I was reading all around it, but I thought that his work was about clinical psychology, which it is not. It's not about clinical psychology at all. And it's about religion. And, the C.G. Jung institutes around the world are aimed at clinical psychology. And so this is why Jung said, thank God I'm Jung, so I don't have to be a Jungian.
Right. I love that. I love that. Yeah, you guys go have your fun, but that's not, you missed the point. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so anyway, so there is a living God, and that living God is within us. It's actually not like the God that any of the religions actually talk about, but even the Bhagavad Gita admits it. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita admits that these are visions that Arjuna had. And so the whole Bhagavad Gita, the story of the Bhagavad Gita takes place in an instant. Okay, it's Arjuna never actually enters the battle, or right at the end, he may actually enter the battle, but the whole of the Bhagavad Gita is something that happens in his psyche. And so 5,000 years ago, the way that the way the writers of the Bhagavad Gita could talk about it was in the context of an external God. But, they actually were admitting right from the beginning of their writing that they were talking about a psychological event that occurred within Arjuna at the moment that he entered the battlefield, and he had, one side on one side of him and the other side on the other side of him, and he was in a chariot between them, and he, in however many seconds it took, he experienced the entire Bhagavad Gita, and it says it explicitly there, and that's what Dr. Jung was talking about, and this is why he put a quote from the Bhagavad Gita right next to his image of Philemon in the Red Book, exactly for that reason, to provide that hint. He said, in his lifetime, he said, there's some things I just can't say right now, but I'm going to leave hints that other people can get later on. And, my experience 10 months ago was that when I started to read the Bhagavad Gita and then read it with Khushbu end to end, it was like being hit in the side of the head with a 2x4. Because it wasn't a hint, it was a pow, because he was literally saying, this is what my psychology is about,
right?
And that, that aha moment I had was what he intended for somebody to have. He wrote that, he did that, he left that hint for me.
Well, yeah, just only for you.
Yeah, really only for me, because I'm probably the only American that reads Jung and the Bhagavad Gita who's made 44 trips to India, and therefore I know something about the Indian way of looking at things too.
Right, right. And it's interesting to me. It's like, solipsism, which is this philosophy that only the self exists, almost as a propaganda philosophy that is countergrain to Jung, where if Jung said only the self exists, I'd say, great, let's do that. Whereas with Solipsism, it's all about the narcissistic, low grade, superficial stuff. And so with Jung, except Jung doesn't want the self as a religion. He wants life to be lived rather than have a religion.
Right. So I have to say hello to Art Patterson, who's been following me for quite a long time. Good morning, Art. And Danny says, 7 Sermons to the Dead is my favorite part of the Red Book. Don't fully understand it, but keep listening to the audio. Well, it's deep, and but it begins with the pilgrims coming to the door and saying, we've been to Jerusalem where we have not found what we sought. And I've been to Jerusalem, and I understand exactly what that meant, because in Jerusalem, that's not where God lived or ever lived. That's where Jesus Christ lived, yes, of course, and where many of the events of the Bible occurred. But what they sought was in the heart. It's not in a place. And so you can go on a pilgrimage, and Jerry actually leads pilgrimages to many holy places. And so if you go on a pilgrimage to some place like Stonehenge, let's say Stonehenge, that's one that we all know, you're not going to have necessarily the same numinous experience that those Stone Age people had, which caused them to be willing to drag huge stones weighing 20 and 30 tons across 20 miles so that they could set up this I don't know what you would call it, an obelisk or something.
The stone circle, right?
Yeah, the stone circle. And to set it up in a certain way that was astronomically correct, thousands of years ago. And the average life expectancy in those days was 20 years. And so there wasn't a lot of time to reflect on what the hell this means, but they obviously had some numinous experience that caused them to be willing to physically move those stones and set that up.
And set them up in such a way that twice or 4 times a year on the equinox and the solstice, that a certain stone and a certain light would occur. The certain effect on a stone with a light would occur, where you only see that twice a year, and that connects them to nature.
Right. And so so you can go to Stonehenge on the summer solstice, for example, and you can see how that plays through. But the chances are you're just going to see a lot of big rocks and the sun come up. You probably won't have the same numinous experience that the people that built that had. And so that's the same point. I've been to Stonehenge and I did not find what I sought. Well, you can go to Jerusalem or any other pilgrimage site, and you can go to Lourdes, and for example, and many people do and make pilgrimages to Lourdes, but the chances of you seeing the Virgin Mary at Lourdes are zilch and none.
Well, yeah, that's the God and Jesus sitting there talking, and Jesus says, hey, Dad, we haven't been seen for a while. And he's like, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe we should start showing up on toast.
which they do.
Yeah, what they do, exactly.
Right. And so, so anyway,
you're right though about lords. I mean, when that experience is not there.
Right. So that's my reference back to Seven Sermons of the Dead, which, people don't understand that first passage where the pilgrims said, we have been to Jerusalem and we did not find what we sought. What they meant was they did not have a numinous experience of God, whether they, or at least that part of Carl Jung didn't have that experience. He recognized that because he was referring to a vision that he had when he wrote that book.
Well, that whole phrase there, we have been to Jerusalem and did not find what we sought, is the trickster story of the Grail. And as Emma Jung and Mary Louise von France so wonderfully put forth in their work, that we are each the Holy Grail, the vessel and that which is filled. And so when you go to Jerusalem, so to speak, or actually, you're looking outside yourself for something that's already within.
So Danny says, not very original, but I find ancient Egypt interesting, not just because of the Great Pyramid, but their gods look cool. Their gods look cool. Then,
well, Danny, I would recommend.
I
would recommend this book, The Temple and Man, by R.A. Schwaller de Lubisch. It's the sacred architecture and the perfect man, and it's wonderful. This is a little 132-page small one. There's also the big 2-volume tome set I have buried over here, but it's the Temple of Luxor at Karnak. And if you even see the image here, the floor plan, but then you have the pharaoh overlaid. And there are multiple ways that the skeleton has been overlaid, and even the different functions of the temple magic that they would worship or meditate with were actually organized on the human brain. So if you're interested in Egypt, it's one of my favorite things, but The Temple and Man by R.A. Schwaller de Lubisch might be of interest to you.
So Danny has restored his comment, in part at least, and says, not very original, but love ancient Egypt, not just because the Great Pyramid, etc., but their gods look kind of like action figures. And, that's another
nice.
Another great example where obviously it took a lot of Egyptians having numinous experiences to cause the kind of collective effort that created those pyramids.
Right.
And again, they are astrologically correct. They point in a certain way. And
they're aligned with Orion's belt.
Right. And they were built, I think, 7,000 years ago or something like that. So obviously human beings at that time did have numinous experiences that caused them to build that. But if you go to Egypt, you're just going to see a pile of rock, right? And if you look at the Sphinx, you're going to see a sculpture that's been vandalized, but it's just a bunch of rock. And
and if you're standing,
I'm not saying you wouldn't have a numinous experience there, but the numinous experience you would have isn't the numinous experience that the Egyptians had. Okay, because you wouldn't have the experience which causes you to go build a pyramid. And so not to say you won't have one.
Right.
Okay, you may have a numinous experience that causes you to go build something. That's absolutely true. And I certainly have had many numinous experiences that have caused me to build this YouTube channel. And so you can have a numinous experience that causes you to build something, but it's not necessarily going to cause you to build a pyramid. And that only seems to have happened, in those days long ago. And imagining the human effort that went into building that is just phenomenal. And being there is phenomenal for that reason, for the architectural reason, for the logos reason of, how the hell did these guys do this? And
yeah, just even logistics.
And we even know how it was done. And another example is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, because in Western Europe, the tradition was that it would take 100 years to build a cathedral. And that was in the Middle Ages that was taking place. But the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul was built about 550 AD, about 550. So in Western Europe context during the Dark Ages. And it didn't take them 100 years to build Hagia Sophia. It took them 5 years. And it had a dome in it, which at the time and for the next 1,000 years was the largest dome in the world in any place. It was the largest dome at any place until the 15th century when the Dome of St. Peter's was built in Rome. But for that 1,000 years, from 550 AD to around 14 something, so maybe 900 years, there was no dome bigger than that. And so then they started to be built in cathedrals, so that now if I go over to the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy, which is the cathedral of the Navy, it's built in the form of a traditional European cathedral. It does have a dome in the center of it, and centered on the cross, on the center of the cross. So there's a dome there. I haven't measured it to know whether it's bigger than Hagia Sophia or St. Peter's, probably not. But it's a cathedral that seats 2,000 people, so it isn't nothing,
right?
And it has an organ that some people say has 3,000 pipes in it. I think they might have gotten it wrong by a factor of 10, but there are certainly 300 pipes there, and it's an amazing organ. And I know a man who still lives here and who is the organist of the U.S. Naval Academy, and he was a bandsman, a Navy bandsman, and when he was like 20 or something like that, and he got assigned to the Naval Academy where he was playing for funerals and weddings, and he heard that organ and he said, that's my instrument. And he's been there now for 40 years and he won't give up the instrument. And so, that certainly is a numinous experience for him. And so anyway.
Well, when you bring up the pyramids, if as an architect, previously, the ability to discern places of peace and places of power, like to know that I'm standing here, but if I walk 6 feet over there, it's going to light me up. And it's interesting that near the Sphinx, someone like that, with that same kind of attenuation that I have, was standing admiring the Sphinx, and then looked at the pyramids and looked around, and then walked back to the Nile and went, something's wrong. Something's missing. And caused him to start to research. And now the jury's out, but there might have been a second Sphinx next to the Sphinx. And that would then make sense. Patriarchy, matriarchy. Why did they take the other one down if it's there? So there's a church metaphor there of all too logos, all too male, or all too, out here. if one of the unseen partners. So then that if this other Sphinx exists, it's the Sphinx's unseen partner.
Okay,
Now,
so let me make one observation now because it's getting late. We've managed to get through one page of Jerry Wright's book, page 25 of A Mystical Path Less Traveled. And we've managed to get through
one page.
We've managed to get through two pages of Diane Croft's book, The Unseen Partner, here. And I just want to emphasize that both of these individuals are going to speak to us live in April. And I want to put the MailChimp address on. So if you would like to be on the panel so that you can ask them directly questions about their books, those would be the good times. So if you register on the MailChimp list, you will receive the notices of the times and everything, and the links. So they're all unique links. And so, I'll just say that those presentations, if you want to watch on YouTube, you can watch them on YouTube also, but they'll be on April 11th is Diane Croft, April 18th is Jerry Wright, and April 25th is the second half of Diane Croft's presentation. And so I urge you to come and listen to them live. And, theoretically, you can ask questions on YouTube, but sometimes I get too busy to refer to YouTube when we're having a guest speaker. And so if you want to ask a question, then join our panel on that day by coming to the Zoom part of the session. And the only way you're going to do that is if you have the links that you're going to get if you register on the MailChimp list. So I just want to emphasize that. Obviously, these books are quite profound, and they gave us a lot to talk about today, even though we only got through, we got through 4 pages of Diane's, 4 pages of Diane's book and 1 page of Jerry's book. So,
well, the density, I mean, and not only just profound, the density, but in such an accessible way, via beauty, primarily, and the clarity that brings about to me, that's really heartening also too for more people who, they're not going to want to live in the Latin and Greek footnotes, and they don't want the original translation, and nor should they need to. I mean,
right.
No one needs to be geek like me, so, but at the same time, these, I think, present to a wider audience these same concepts that then dial in some potential interest in Jung, in Dr. Jung. And I think it's for the better, because I think there'll be some great takeaway when people discover that.
And we're talking about the essence of the issue about Jordan Peterson. Okay, because I too am extremely impressed by Jordan Peterson. I have to tell you that. And I agree with him 99.5% of the time. And I'm also extremely impressed by his wife, Tammy. She did an interview about her illness recently, which is profound. I mean, it is really impressive discussion of her finding God and being near death and having now completely recovered. And she came to a point where she had to decide whether she should live or die. And she told that to her family, and her family was totally appalled that she was thinking in those terms, and that caused her to decide for living as opposed to dying. But lots of people come to that crossroad.
Right.
And so I really urge you to take a look at that interview. Let me see if I can find the name of it here quickly. I do have it here because I've been watching it myself, and I've been extremely impressed by it. It's Tammy Peterson on tragic illness, finding God, and something else, gratitude. And it's on a website called Theories of Everything, or it's on a YouTube channel called Theories of Everything, but it's Tammy Peterson with Kurt Jaimungal, Jaimungal. And I would just say that I'm extremely impressed with Kurt as well. He's the interviewer, and he does this interview in an incredibly sensitive manner, a very powerful manner. And so I would want to look more into Kurt as well. I may want to interview Kurt. I do want to interview Kurt, but I haven't contacted him, nor have I contacted Tammy. But her story of her near-death experience and what she had to do to recover is certainly numinous. It gives me goosebumps just talking about it, what she had to go through. And yet she's now completely cured. And her experience with God at that point is very powerful. And so please understand, when I say God, I don't mean the God that the Abrahamic religions talk about, not the God out there, not at all. And,
Yeah, not the adult version of the Easter Bunny. I mean,
right, exactly. And when I wrote a book called Tsunami of Blood back in 2007, you can find that on Amazon if you want. It's called Tsunami of Blood. It has a really cool cover if you haven't looked at the cover of it. but anyway, when I wrote that book and my wife read it, she never reads anything that I'm writing as I'm writing. She only reads it after it's published. And so after it was published, she read my book. And she said, well, I was surprised to see you refer to God so much in the book. And when I published it, she and I had been together for 22 years at that point, and we had never gone to church together as a thing, except to be supportive of her mother on Christmas and during, weddings and funerals. We've been in churches, but that's the only time. So she said, I was surprised to see you refer to God so much in that book. And, I'm in that sense, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about the God that of Abrahamic religions, the oh my God, the God that Jerry refers to here, where, what did he say? God has become a lazy word employed when we don't want to do the difficult work of theological reflection. It is a throwaway word, as OMG in the modern lexicon, or as a blessing at the end of a sneeze. It will be an awkward, difficult transition to find and use words. And so, yes, I agree that it will be an awkward and difficult transition, but that doesn't mean that there is no God. There is God. And I do agree with Jerry about what God is. And the difference between Jerry and Jordan Peterson is that Jordan Peterson, when asked, do you believe in God? He goes into great angst about the question. And then he says, I believe as if God exists. Mm-hmm. But he can't cross the line and say, God exists and I know what
And
that
I know,
is.
right.
I know what that is. Okay. And that's the distinction that I'm making with Paul, which is, okay, Jordan can't cross the boundary to the Abrahamic religions or Christianity or what have you, as Paul would like him to do, but that's not the boundary that we're talking about here. The boundary is between rationality, logos, and the God that lives in eros within you. That's what we're talking about. So,
and there's a felt quality to the know.
Oh yes, if you know God, then you know God. You no longer have to believe. Just as Jung said in 2005, I listened to his video, "Do you believe in God?" when he was asked that question back in the mid-50s, and he said, "Very difficult question. I have no need to believe. I know." And this is what he knew. It took me 10 years to work that out, but I'm giving it to everybody for free.
Well, yeah, I mean, I personally put in my vote on the top of Mount Democrat at 14,363 feet near Breckenridge, Colorado.
Right.
I mean,
yeah. And Debbie just showed me a movie that has been held closely in Buddhist circles for some time, but it is going to be released to theaters, at least in a limited fashion, sometime later this year. And it's called Wandering But Not Lost. And it's about a very prominent Buddhist monk who is internationally famous. He was internationally famous before what happened in this movie, and he already was the main monk for like 3 different monasteries in different continents and that sort of thing. So he was extremely well known, but he wanted to go on a walking retreat, a silent retreat, where he just put himself loose and without plan and without money, or not much money. And so one fine day, he left his monastery, sneaked out so that even the security guard didn't know he was gone. And he disappeared entirely for 2 years. And then, and a couple of times he was outed because a couple of times people recognized him. And, but he just ignored that they were recognizing him and went on. And he just started walking through India up into the Himalayas. And he was literally meditating in caves, as the ancient Tibetan Buddhists did. And he managed to survive for 2 years in that fashion, as basically as a beggar, except he wasn't a beggar. He was actually people were making gifts to him left, right, and center. But he wasn't admitting his identity. And after 2 years, one of his followers did out him in Nepal and recognized him. And so the man that this is about, Mingyur Rinpoche, told his friend that he could come on the retreat too. But he had to go away and come back. And so this guy came back and
gone, probably.
a few months later, and they went on more than 2 years more of retreat.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But when he came back, and this is really, I mean, it's beautifully filmed, but when he came back, he he came back with fancy modern sleeping bags and all sorts of other paraphernalia.
He's sponsored by Petzl.
Right. And Mignon Rinpoche.
Yeah. North Face.
He accepted this stuff, but he just laughed. But
not very monastic.
Yeah. So anyway, they went up into the mountains, and I guess after that, I guess they did have sleeping bags. But until then, for 2 years, he was just sleeping on the street like a typical sadhu in India. In fact, he gave up his monastic robes and started to dress like a sadhu, which is a yellow outfit that people who are monastic Hindus do, but especially around Varanasi in India. And so, because he was trying to hide his identity while he was doing this. And anyway, they stayed out on this retreat, or he did for 2 years, and then with this other guy for another 2 years. So 4 years in total. And during that time, a lot of the time he was up in the mountains and living a very, very humble life, eating berries and that sort of thing. And then he came back, and now they've made this movie about it. And it is just phenomenal. So
Wandering but not lost.
Wandering but not lost. So when you ever see that come out on YouTube or on Netflix or wherever it is, by all means see that movie. It's very, very interesting.
Will do.
And so Gander Stein says, if you knew the experiences that I've had tied to synchronicity symbols, Carl Jung, and spiritual matters, you'd likely be astonished as I have been. There's no doubt that life has meaning. Well, absolutely. And none of us are going to have the same numinous experiences, but the issue is to recognize what a numinous experience is first,
right.
And then to put it in the proper context in the sense of your life, and it's going to make a lot of difference to you if you do that.
Right.
And so with that, I'm going to call it a day. Thank you, Jordan, for being with me.
Oh, definitely. Good to be back.
It's definitely helpful when you're here offering your perceptions on these issues.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Forward. So we have a lot to go here because we got through one page of Jerry.
I love that.
Jerry Wright's book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled, by Jerry R. Wright. And so I would urge everyone to get yourself a copy of it and buy it from Chiron Publications. They will probably appreciate it if you buy it from them rather than Amazon. I'm just putting the name down here, Chiron Publications. And Diane Croft's book can be purchased directly from her at, see myself, okay, The Unseen Partner. And literally the website is theunseenpartner.com. So I'm sure Diane would appreciate it if you bought her book from her directly, as opposed to from YouTube, or I'm sorry, from Amazon. But both books are available in both places. And so have a good week. And
you too. And I'll see you tomorrow night.
Yeah, and Jordan and I will see you tomorrow for
Tarot is a roadmap for life.
Right. And we're going to be talking about the King and Queen of Wands, and probably we'll talk about the Dark Goddess as well.